Hi guys, it's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, and I am just at the airport now heading back from the Star Trek convention, and I just wanted to tell you about it. I'm wearing my Mirror Universe, Star Trek Mirror Universe shirt, and we screened Far Beyond the Stars, the Deep Space Nine episode I came up with. So I'm going to tell you all about the Star Trek convention and what we did there, and the birth of Far Beyond the Stars, because I think you'll find it very fun and very interesting. So essentially, I got an email a few weeks ago from the creation convention, the Star Trek convention in Las Vegas, asking if I would like to come to the 25th anniversary of the debut of Deep Space Nine, and they were going to screen Far Beyond the Stars, the episode that my name is on, and they'd have a panel and a screening, and they'd give me a table, and I said sure. So I flew out here, and they gave me a table, and since I had a table, I thought I would have some photos of myself from Deep Space Nine with Armin Shimmerman as Quark, and on the set of Far Beyond the Stars. And as a last-minute thought, I brought the new editions of the new edition of the Twilight Zone Companion, and sold a few of those, which was kind of fun. And off we went. And so I was talking to a lot of people, and it was great. I was telling them about Space Command and giving out free Space Command posters, and people were telling me how much they loved my work. And it was funny because some people recognized me from Mr. Sci-Fi, and some people knew me from the Twilight Zone Companion, some people knew me from Star Trek, etc., etc., etc. And people were from all over the world, and it was really, I enjoyed it very much. And then came the screening of Far Beyond the Stars. It was the last event of the convention, and it was really quite amazing because over several days I'd been meeting the actors, reconnecting with the actors from Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I also wrote for, and the actors from Star Trek Discovery and from Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager, and some of them I've already worked with in Space Command, Doug Jones and Robert Picardo, of course, and then Ethan Phillips, who played Neelix in Star Trek Voyager, and my dear friend Armin Shimmerman, who played Quark on Deep Space Nine. They're going to be in Space Command upcoming, but I also talked to Doug Tate, who was an alien in JJ's Star Trek movie, and he's been in many other things, and he's going to be a creature, an alien in the second hour, 2-hour story we're going to be shooting the rest of in December, Forgiveness, and I was talking to Nana Visitor and Terry Farrell and just tons of folks who are connected with the new with the Star Trek Old and New. And so, for instance, there's an actress who plays one of the bridge crew on Star Trek Discovery, and she's really interesting, and I liked her very much. And so I'm going to be singing about auditioning her for a role on Space Command, and on and on. It was just really an interesting time. But so then it came the time for them to screen Far Beyond the Stars. Now, for those of you who've never seen it, I recommend you see it. It's available, I think, now on Netflix and other places, and DVD and Blu-ray. And the basic plot is that Sisko finds himself as a different person back in the 1950s, a science fiction writer named Benny Russell, a black writer writing under a white pseudonym about a white future where there are no black people, and he's writing a lie. And finally he's given a cover painting to write the story of, and it's a 1950s version of Deep Space Nine, and he writes a story about Deep Space Nine, a future where, you know, black people and aliens and people from everywhere are getting along and working together. And it's the first time Star Trek dealt overtly with racism with the primary cast. So they'd done the half black, half white one on the original Star Trek, that episode with Frank Gorshin doing what he thought was acting, and but they had never actually had any character on any of the Deep Space Nine, any of the Star Trek series, say, I'm a black person. And it was an amazingly brave episode, and we're all enormously proud of it. And it was so fun to be backstage in the green room, and they were watching the episode. Now, normally in a green room, there's stuff going on the monitors, and no one's really paying attention, and everyone's talking, and it's noisy and boisterous, and people are coming and going. When I went in to the green room when they were screening Far Beyond the Stars, everyone was just watching it, utterly rapt, utterly engaged by it. You could hear a pin drop, and these were the actors of Star Trek Discovery and Deep Space Nine. It was phenomenal, and of course the actors of Star Trek Discovery didn't know this episode existed. So I was talking to the lead actress from from Star Trek Discovery, and the actress who, I mean, all the entire cast. And I was just talking to them, and they were very, very kind and very impressed. And then we went out, the Deep Space Nine cast, and Ira Behr and I went out on the stage, and we received a thunderous ovation from thousands of people who had just watched the episode and loved it. And then we started talking, and many of the actors I had not seen since they shot the episode. It had been 20 years, so I saw Nana Visitor, and I've seen Rene Auberjonois subsequently, and he's going to be in Space Command. That's my intent. And but many of the other actors, Terry Farrell, she's back in LA now, so I'm going to get together with her. And I also talked to Gates McFadden from Star Trek: The Next Generation. These are actors, and of course. The actor who played Riker, he and I are going to get together, and I was asking him, he's a director now, but I was saying, are you still acting? And he says, when they ask me. And I said, well, I'm asking. So hopefully he can be in Space Command as well. But it was really great because the moderator, Adam Malin, who puts on the conventions, he started by asking, it was a big panel because it was the entire cast except for Avery Brooks and me and Ira Behr, who was the executive producer. And Adam said, well, Ira, why don't you tell us about how this episode came into existence? And Ira was kind enough to say, well, I think that's something for Marc to talk about. So he threw it to me, and I really wanted to tell the story of how that episode came to be, because the great thing about Star Trek is that you can do episodes that are iconic and unlike anything that's ever been done on television before. And Sitting on the Edge of Forever on the original Star Trek told me that you could do that, and told me that you could do something that would change people's lives and be incredibly meaningful and a profound truth about real life set in a science fiction universe. And that the fact that it was science fiction would make it timeless, just like Rod Serling with Twilight Zone. You can watch those now, and they seem every bit as much about our current lives as the lives that were being led in the late 50s and early 60s. So I started talking about it, and I said the genesis of the story, and here it is. And when I was a kid, when I was 10, Star Trek came on the air, and I was watching these episodes, and week after week after week, they were astonishing. They were like nothing that had ever been on television before. They were deeply moving. They were profoundly truthful, and particularly City on the Edge of Forever, which said, basically there'll be times in your life when you know what's right to do, and it'll break your heart, but you have to do it anyway. And it was the first time I ever saw any TV show, and in every TV show I'd seen before that, the hero saved the girl. It was just de rigueur, it was expected. But in this one, he throws her under a truck to save the future, and it was amazing. It was so truthful. And then Kirk says, let's get the hell out of here. And for a hero to say hell on television back in 1966-67 was unheard of. It was, it was like saying much worse language now. So this really was hugely formative to me, and I got to meet Nichelle Nichols sometime later, and she gave me a signed script and signed copy of her own Star Trek script, and now we're talking to Nichelle about being in Space Command, and I've written a scene for her, and I hope we can do it. I'd love to. And then I went on Star Trek set when I was a kid and watched them shoot Turnabout Intruder. So this was all enormously influential on me, and then I read The Making of Star Trek when I was 13, and that's when I started thinking maybe I could be a writer-producer working in television. So then flash forward to years later, and Star Trek: The Next Generation comes on, and I sell them the storyline for First Contact, and meantime I'm writing for a million other shows, and then I'm invited to pitch to Deep Space Nine. And by then, Armin Shimmerman has become a good friend. I wrote for his character Pascal on Beauty and the Beast, and I've hired him on other shows, and he's become a good friend. And I say to him, look, I'm going to come up with an idea where people, the audience, will be able to see your face for the first time on Deep Space Nine, and he was very enthusiastic about that. And so when I was a teenager, my heroes, the shows that made me want to be a writer were Star Trek and Outer Limits and Twilight Zone, the original versions of those. And my heroes were not the actors, as much as I admire them and respect them. My heroes were the writers. And so I would notice the writers, the names on the credits: George Clayton Johnson and Theodore Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison and D.C. Fontana and David Gerrold, and on, Richard Matheson, and of course Gene Roddenberry and Gene L. Kuhn so forth, Charles Beaumont. And so as soon as I was old enough, I started going to science fiction conventions when I was a teenager, and I would seek out these writers, because the wonderful thing about science fiction, and I was reading science fiction books voraciously from as soon as I could read, so I was reading the work of these writers as well, because they wrote books and short stories as well. And so I knew them very well from the work they'd done in the 50s for the science fiction magazines, and the work they'd done in the 60s and on. So as soon as I was like 15, 16 years old, I started going to science fiction conventions, and many of these writers became friends and mentors. So Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote Amok Time and Shore Leave, 2 great episodes of Star Trek, became my friend and mentor. And the irony, and I was aware that he had written for the pulp magazines, Galaxy, magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Worlds of If, Astounding, in the 50s, and yet here he was when I knew him. He'd go to a science fiction convention, and he'd be like a god, but then he'd go out in the real world, and he was living this impoverished life. And in fact, he wasn't even living in an apartment. He was living in a converted laundry room with this miniature door, and I cracked my head on the upper bar of it, because it wasn't like Morlock sized, it wasn't human sized. And so I was very struck with the irony of that, the life of such incredible imagination and such galaxy-spanning stories that brought about the space program, that brought about an enormous change in our world, and brought about Star Trek and Star Wars and all these things that have changed people's lives. But most people didn't know about those guys who were writing for a penny a word or 5 cents a word for the love of it in the 1950s for the magazines, and for a very small audience at that point. And I wanted to write about that. I wanted to say, this is where we came from, this is why this is important, this is how it can change lives, because by writing about something in a science fictional or fantasy context, it takes it out of the moment, the current moment, and it takes it out of political ideology, so you can really see it from a fresh perspective. And then Harlan Ellison, who had also become my friend and mentor, and I just did a video on him. We just lost him a few weeks ago, sadly. Harlan did a cassette tape where he talked for about an hour about what it was like to write for those magazines back then, to write for all those wonderful editors, and he was living in New York, and he was a young man on the hustle, and he was trying to get assignments, and you had to write a lot to make a living, because you were being paid a penny a word, 5 cents a word. It was even as low as prices were back then, that was still a mighty hard go. And so what Harlan mentioned was that back then, many times they would commission the cover of the magazine before they had a story written, and he would know which days those cover paintings were delivered to the magazine, and he would rush across town to be the first writer to get into the office of that magazine, and then he would rhapsodize about the cover to the editor, and he would say he had a great idea for a story, and he mentioned one that was like just the worst ever, which was a painting of a woman sunbathing on a New York tenement rooftop, and a giant grasshopper is peering over the rim of the roof at her. And it was just god-awful, but he had to make it sound like it was the Mona Lisa, and he had a great idea for it. And I've actually got that magazine at home, and it was very, very fun. And so this gave me the idea, basically, for Far Beyond the Stars, because the idea was there'd be an episode where one of our characters would go back in time, and he wouldn't be himself, he would be a writer, writing in the 50s, and all the other characters in the office and in his life would be sort of the inspirations for the characters in Deep Space Nine, and then he would get the cover of Deep Space Nine, the cover of the magazine, which would show sort of a 1950s version of the space station, and he would start writing the Deep Space Nine stories. And my rationale for this in the story initially was very different, because you can't just go as a freelancer. When you're on staff, you can say, well, let's have it be a hallucination, let's have it be a dream, but you can never do that when you're a freelancer, because they'll throw you out. It's lazy writing, So I would never have the temerity to pitch that pretty much ever, but particularly as a freelancer. So I went in and I pitched to Hans Beimler at Paramount at the Deep Space Nine offices, and Hans he was an executive producer on Star Trek, and he'd been my boss on Beyond Reality, a show that I was an executive story a story editor on for 2 years for USA Cable, kind of an X-Files kind of show before X-Files. It starred Sherry Belafonte, and so I was very good friends with Hans, and I went in and I pitched that story, and he loved it, but they didn't buy it. So a year goes by, and I'm by then I've been hired on Sliders, and at the same time I'm developing all the storylines for Animorphs, the TV show, and writing all the outlines and several scripts to set the tone of the show. And I've sold the 3 Magic Time novels, and I'm co-writing one with Barbara Hambly and laying out the other with Maya Bonhoff, and I'm working as a producer on Sliders, and I'm the producer on the entire 4th season. We're reinventing the show, making it better, and I'm writing a lot of episodes. In fact, I'm writing 2 episodes back to back when I get a phone call in my office at Universal, and it's Hans Beimler, and he says, it's been a year since I pitched to him, right? And he says, I've got great news for you. We're buying, you're Far Beyond the Stars. And I say, great timing, Hans. I'm writing 2 episodes of Sliders back to back. And but I was thrilled, of course. And so the only time I had available to meet with the writers, the writing staff on Deep Space Nine, was my lunch hour. So I drove over the hill from Universal to Paramount, and there was a restaurant next to Paramount called Nickadel's, and we all got together around this big table. It was the entire writing staff. So it was the showrunner, Ira Behr. It was Ron Moore, who's late of Battlestar Galactica and Outlander, and Hans Beimler, and Robert Hewitt Wolf, and I think Brian Fuller may have been there. I think the writing team that went on to Battlestar Galactica was there. It was just basically the A-list of writers working in science fiction television, and they all knew I was the author of the Twilight Zone Companion. They were all big fans of that. Many of them had read it, and it had been part of the reason they were now professional writers, and they loved Twilight Zone. So they said to me, we really want to do this like a Twilight Zone episode. We really want it to be like a Twilight Zone episode on Deep Space Nine, and so we don't want it to be. We want it to be a hallucination, almost like a dream, and we'll make it. I had made it initially Jake, Ben Sisko's son, because Jake was an aspiring writer and it seemed natural. But Ira said, no, let's make it Ben Sisko, because then the stakes will be higher. And of course, I loved that. And every choice that Ira was making was moving the story toward more profundity, more truth, more risk. And that's really the mark of a great story editor, because a bad story editor will choose the cliche, will choose the safe story, something that's going to not ruffle any feathers but will not be memorable. But Ira was very talented, very, very talented, and brave. So Ira starts talking, and the whole staff, we start batting around the story, and we say, well, let's have it be Ben, and of course he'll be a different person in the past, and let's make it. And Ira's idea was let's make it overtly about race. He's a black writer, writing about white future, and he's writing a lie, and ultimately he has to write the truth. He has to write the truth. I'm at the airport. He has to write the truth of his life, and so I thought that was just terrific. And he said, let's have Avery Brooks direct it, and it's going to be very difficult to get this approved by the studio, but we're going to go for it. So we all knew this was going to be spectacular. We were all incredibly excited, and it was the idea that all the actors who normally are in makeup, you would see them as characters in the 1950s. So that weekend I went home. I actually was at my office at Universal, and I wrote the outline, and it was a great outline, and it followed the storyline that we'd all talked about, and it was, basically Ben finds himself as Benny Russell back in the 50s in Manhattan, and he lives in Harlem, and he writes in this magazine office. So during the day he hangs out with all the white writers, and at night he goes to his black friends in Harlem, who are saying, why are you writing a future where we don't exist? And so my outline basically followed the episode that you see in terms of the structure. The main differences were, in the episode, the actor who plays Worf is a baseball player, and in my version he was a boxer, and he's having a secret relationship with a white woman, and the cops find out, and they basically beat him to death. And that was sort of the Great White Hope kind of idea. And in the episode as aired, Worf is a baseball player, but Jake is a character named Jimmy, who's sort of a young guy in the neighborhood, and he tries to steal a car, and the cops murder him, and he's got a crowbar. They said he had a weapon, and Sisko, tries to, cry out for justice. And it was astonishing watching this with the cast of Star Trek Discovery and with the cast of Deep Space Nine, yesterday, because to have them have the cops the racist cops shoot a black guy who's basically unarmed and who's like a teenager was so current to our modern day, and it was astonishing to see it now and realize how it hasn't aged a bit, how it's still every bit as relevant and every bit as powerful, and particularly to watch it with, I can never get her name right, Sonequa Michael Green, whatever her name is, who's the star of Discovery, to have her watching that scene as a black woman was just great. It was just so great to have created something that a network would air. It was so bold. It was so brave back then to actually not split the difference, but have the cops actively be the racists and to present the truth as we all saw it. And again, that's not to slam cops. That's not to paint everyone with a brush, but it's just to say this is stuff that happens. So, okay. So, I'm just making sure I'm not missing my flight while I'm telling you this story. So I wrote the outline, great outline, and I also called Harlan Ellison while I was writing the outline. I was asking him questions about what it was like to write back in the 50s, and and he was saying, he was telling me, and I was asking, were there any black writers who wrote under white pseudonyms? And he told me about a guy he knew named Frank Yerby, who wasn't a science fiction writer, but was a mainstream novelist, and he was writing as a white writer. There were no photos of him on his books, apparently. And Harlan was telling me about what New York was like in the 50s, and I was using a lot of the details that he was telling me. And so I turned in the outline. It was great. And as a producer working at that level, and being a producer on a show at Universal, I fully expected to write the script, because then I never would I wouldn't get cut off at story. That wasn't what happened. So basically, I turned in the outline. I was getting ready to write that script, and then Hans Beimler calls me, and he says, we're going to write the script in-house. And I said, what are you talking about? And it was, they wanted to fast-track it for Sweeps Week. Sweeps Week was when they air the episodes they think will get the highest rating, because that's when they set their ad rates with their sponsors. So they want to fast track it and shoot it very quickly, and so they didn't think I would have the time to write it. But of course I would. I'm a TV writer. I can write very fast and very well fast. And so I called Ira Bear, and I said, Ira, I want to write this script. And he explained that they wanted to fast track it, and he said, look, I'll make you a deal. If you quit your job at Sliders, I'll give you the script assignment. And I actively considered it. I really considered it, because we all knew this was going to be a classic. We all knew this was going to be phenomenal. We were all thrilled. And I actually considered it, but I couldn't do it, because I was writing 2 episodes of Sliders back to back, World Killer and Slide Cage, and they were depending on me. The entire team was depending on me, and if I quit, they would have been really, really, really screwed. So I regretfully had to say I cannot do it. But I knew that Ira and Hans were terrific writers, and I knew that they would follow the outline and do a great job, and that's exactly what happened. So then one week I had the amazing honor of having 2 studios shooting my work simultaneously. They were shooting Slide Cage on a stage at Universal, and they were shooting Far Beyond the Stars on a stage at Paramount. And so I went and got photos of myself with both casts at 2 studios the same day, with me in the same clothes. And I was actually signing that photo to fans throughout the last few days. So I went on the set of Deep Space Nine, and it was made to look like a 1950s magazine office, and everyone was in suit and tie, and it was the entire cast. And Avery Brooks was directing it, and he was kind of, as he was directing, he was kind of looking at me out of the corner of his eye, because he didn't know me. I knew Armin, but I'd never met Avery. And so finally he says, cut, and he says, everybody go to lunch. And then I walk up to him and I say, hi Mr. Brooks, I'm Marc Zicree. I'm the writer who came up with this story. And he says, everybody stop. And he puts his arm around me and he says, say to them what you just said to me. And I say, I came up with this story? And he says, he came up with a story. And everyone applauded me, and it was a wonderful moment. And it was much like the moment yesterday when thousands and thousands of people gave us a standing ovation. And then I was on the panel with Ira, and I was on the panel with Renee Auberjonois and Terry Farrell and Nana Visitor and Armin Shimmerman and on, and we were all talking about this episode that we all loved, and we all gave it our best, and we all worked really hard to make it wonderful, and we all succeeded. I'm so proud of it, and I'm so glad that I was able to share it with the world. And it was all thanks to Ted Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison and all the dear people who mentored me and inspired me. So that's it for now, but I will be posting a lot more. You know, we have a Space Command campaign going at Kickstarter, so if you can go on Kickstarter and type in Space Command Redemption and throw some money our way, that'd be much appreciated. So until next time, it's Mr. Sci-Fi. Take care. Bye-bye.